In this video, we will show you how to replace your front steering knuckle on this Toyota Sienna. This is part of your front steering and suspension, located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. We're going to have to safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, to remove the wheel, remove all 5 of your 21mm lug nuts. We'll pay attention in the area where you can see the outer tie rod end connected to the steering knuckle. For this, we're going to remove the locking cotter pin, and then we can also remove that mounting nut. We'll set that aside for recycling. Use a 17mm to remove the mounting nut here. We'll just start that back on a couple threads. Continuing on, we're going to have to dislodge the outer tie rod end. For this, we can go ahead and use a hammer and we'll tap on the steering knuckle, causing vibration, and it should shake it free. Moving to the front of the steering knuckle, we're going to have to pay attention to our brake caliper. We're going to push back each of our 2 caliper pistons. To push back your caliper pistons, we can use a small pry bar and carefully make our way inside of each of these grooves in the caliper. You can see one here and one just above it. We're prying up against the caliper and the brake rotor, attempting to push back each of our 2 caliper pistons. Slow and steady wins the race here. Once you have movement from the caliper, we'll continue on with our 2 caliper slider mounting bolts. To remove the caliper slider mounting bolts, we'll be using a 14mm. We'll loosen up that upper bolt. A quick inspection, start it back in just a couple threads. At this point, we'll take hold of the caliper and fully remove our final mounting bolt. Once you've dislodged the caliper, the next thing you need to do is pay attention to each one of your caliper pistons and their corresponding dust boots. If you see any fluid making its way out of the dust boots, it means that the seals internally on the caliper are bad and you have to replace the caliper. This one looks fine. We'll set it aside. Continue on to removing your brake pads from the area. Thoroughly inspect your brake pads. If it looks like they need to be replaced, now's the time to do them. To remove your caliper bracket, you'll find that you have 2 17mm headed bolts. You know what to do. We'll fully loosen the upper one. A quick inspection, start it back in a couple threads. Let's get that lower one out of here. Remove your bracket, set it aside. Let's get the rotor off of here. A quick inspection, and go ahead and set it aside. If yours looks like this one, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace it. If you are reusing your original rotor, you need to pay attention along the back side. You can see the mounting area that will go up against your bearing hub. Go ahead and clean that down. You can use a wire brush. Let's have a look along the back side of the steering knuckle. You're going to find your ABS wire, and that leads all the way down to the ABS sensor directly into the steering knuckle. This is held in place with a 10mm headed mounting bolt. We'll go ahead and remove the bolt, a quick inspection, and then remove the sensor as well. There's that mounting bolt. Take hold of the sensor, give it a wiggle, and lift it up and out of place. You want to ensure that this is not cracked or broken in any way. If you do see any damage, go ahead and replace that sensor. Now we'll follow the wire up to where it connects to its mounting point on the top of the steering knuckle. This is just a plastic bracket. Grab on the locking ears, gently separate them, and slide this out of place. We'll set it aside. Let's make our way to the axle nut. To remove this, you'll be using a 12-point 30mm socket. Next, we'll be using a hammer and punch directly in the center of the axle. Just give this a couple taps to break it free. Once you do have movement in this area, we can continue on. Let's move along the top of the knuckle where it connects to your front strut. You'll find that it's held in place in this area with two 22mm headed mounting bolts and two 22mm mounting nuts. We'll hold the bolt head along the front, and we'll remove the mounting nuts along the back side. Leave that one in place. We'll remove the lower hardware. A quick inspection, we will be reusing this. Leave the upper hardware in, and we'll continue on down at the lower ball joint. Removing the lower ball joint is easiest. Rather than making your way up here, we'll follow the lower ball joint to where it connects to the lower control arm. Once you have this dislodged, we can get the whole knuckle over to the bench and fully remove the lower ball joint from your steering knuckle. You have one 17mm bolt and two 17mm nuts. Now, to remove the knuckle from this area, there's a couple things we're going to pay attention to. You still have your one piece of mounting hardware up along the top that we left in place. And then down in the center here, we also have our axle shaft, which makes its way through the center of the bearing and the hub. When you do remove the upper hardware, we're going to slowly start tipping this away. Lift this up away from the lower ball joint area, and then also pull it out away from the axle. Pay attention to that axle here. Be careful not to put a tug on that. We don't want to cause any damage to the axle. Let's get this over to the bench. On the bench, to separate the ball joint from the steering knuckle, you want to remove the locking cotter pin and then your mounting nut. To remove the locking cotter pin, we'll just use some cutters. You can also use pliers, whatever you might happen to have. It's common for these to be rusted and rotted in place. Let's work at it a little bit if necessary. We'll set that aside. Use a 19mm to remove the mounting nut, a quick inspection, and start it back on, just a couple threads. We'll use some penetrant in this area. With that nut in place, we'll continue on, causing some vibration, attempting to break the ball joint stud free from the steering knuckle. When doing so, you want to be extremely careful not to damage the ball joint in any way. We'll just flex the backing plate out of the way if necessary. A quick inspection of the ball joint to ensure it's not damaged in any way. We can set this aside. And there it is, friend. Okay, friend, let's prepare our new knuckle for installation. We'll start with the lower ball joint. What you may find while trying to put it in place is the backing plate is in the way. Now, if that is the case, you could gently flex it out of the way, slide the ball joint in, but you do want to pay attention to the backing plate, ensuring that it's not bent so far that it's going to hit up against your brake rotor. We'll just attempt to slide this in. As you can tell, it's a very tight fit, but it does fit. Now it's time for our mounting nut here. We'll take this and bottom it out. There we are. The torque for this is 91 foot-pounds. What you may find when you go to torque it, everything wants to rock around on you. If you happen to have a vise or something to hold it, you can use that. Otherwise, we'll just be using a bar directly inside of this port. There we are. Once you do have it torqued, the next thing you need to do is pay attention to the slots of your Castle mounting nut. We want to ensure that it's perfectly aligned with the hole that goes through the center of your ball joint stud. If for some reason it's not properly aligned, continue tightening the mounting nut until the very next slot is. After that, put in your locking cotter pin. Make sure you pin it over on the back side there. We don't want this nut loosening up on us while we're driving down the road. Let's get this over to the vehicle. Before we install the knuckle in this area, it's important to make sure you clean and inspect several areas. We'll be using a wire brush for this. We're cleaning the center area of the strut here, where the knuckle will slide into. Pay attention to your axle splines. We need to give these a thorough inspection. Double check to make sure nothing's rotted or damaged on this. We'll lift this out of the way. We'll pay attention to our lower control arm. It's not rotted and weak. We'll apply some copper anti-seize to the splined area, but not necessarily on the threaded area of the axle. Use a glove finger to spread that around. Now to install the steering knuckle, we're going to have to do several things at the same time. Lifting up on the axle, we have to put the ball joint studs down and through that lower control arm. While doing so, we're going to pivot the knuckle up, sliding the axle through the center port of the wheel bearing, and eventually having it up into the position where we can put in our upper mounting bolts, holding the knuckle to the lower portion of the strut. Let's get that lined up with the axle. You can see the axle coming through. Let's align the upper area here for our mounting bolts. Those will come through from the front towards the rear. We've already cleaned and thoroughly inspected our mounting hardware here. There's one. Apply some blue thread locker to the threads of your mounting hardware. We'll continue on with our two mounting nuts here. Go ahead and start those on by hand. Snug them up, torque them to 184 foot-pounds. Let's move down along the bottom to the mounting hardware that holds the ball joint to your lower control arm. Typically for this, you're going to find that you have to pivot the ball joint close to the control arm so you can start in the mounting bolt. Obviously, we're starting this in by hand. We do not want to cross-thread anything. With that started in and snugged up by hand, we can continue on with our two mounting nuts. We'll do the same thing here and torque it to 68 foot-pounds. Let's move along to that ABS sensor. We'll just give this a light coating of grease. This will help us remove it in the future if necessary. Go ahead and take that sensor and we'll put it in place in the steering knuckle here, aligning our mounting bolt hole. We'll start in the mounting bolt and snug it up. We'll torque this to 80 inch-pounds. Double check to make sure that's secured. We'll make our way up to our next mounting point. Get this bracket in place. Let's reinstall our tie rod end here. Continue on with your castle nut. Start it on, snug it up, torque it to 36 foot-pounds. Once you do have that torqued, the next thing you need to do is make sure that you have your castle nut aligned with the hole that goes through the stud of the tie rod. After that, we'll be putting in our locking cotter pin. If it's not properly aligned, continue tightening until the very next slot is. We'll make sure we peen that cotter pin over so there's no way this nut can loosen up on us while we're driving down the road. Let's install our axle nut. When you install your axle nut, you never want to use an impact tool for this. By doing so, you could cause serious damage to your bearing and you will have to replace it. To tighten this, we'll do it by hand. At this point, I have this bottomed out. We're going to get a little closer to the ground so we can torque it to manufacturer's specification. The reason why we have this closer to the ground is because when you go to torque this, it's going to want to turn on you. To help prevent that, you can use a long pry bar directly across the studs of your hub here, but when doing so, you want to be extremely careful not to damage any of the threads. Just use a nice wide bar. At this point, we'll be torquing the axle nut to 217 foot-pounds. Once you do have it torqued, the next thing that you need to do is pay attention to the slot that you can see on the axle shaft here. We're going to use a hammer and punch and drive this nut down into that slot, preventing the nut from loosening up on us while we're driving down the road. Let's use some copper anti-seize on the mating surface here. Just use a glove finger to spread that around. We don't need too much. Now it's time to install that brake rotor. To hold the brake rotor in place, we'll be using one of our original lug nuts. Before we reinstall the caliper bracket, let's make sure that we clean and inspect it. To do that, it's a good idea to make sure that you remove all of your tins and the slider pins and re-lubricate. To start disassembling this caliper bracket, we're going to remove the tins one by one here. As you remove them, it's a good idea to pay attention to the orientation. You can see that certain tins will have the ears facing out to one side and others will have them facing towards the other. Let's do the same to all. Remove your caliper slider pins here. Typically for these, you want to take hold of the pin itself and the boot, gently separate the two, sliding the pin out of the bracket. As you can tell, this one's pretty much stuck in place. We're going to have to work at it a little bit. This can cause a braking issue. Once you do have the slider pin out, the next thing that you need to do is clean and inspect. We're paying attention to the shafted area. If there's any miscellaneous rot or debris, it's going to cause a restriction and you're not going to have proper braking. Also, when you're cleaning, make sure you get to this point, right up closest to my fingers. That's where the boot will sit, and we want to make sure it has a good seal so no moisture or debris makes its way inside, causing an issue. Okay, I've got this pin cleaned up. A thorough inspection. We'll set it aside and repeat the process for the other slider pin. Just give this a quick wipe. There's something I want to show you. If you were to look at the two slider pins side by side, you can see one clear difference. One of them will have a vibration dampener. It's essentially a small piece of rubber. You want to make sure that when you do reinstall these, you have them in the same positioning. We removed it from this port. That's exactly where it'll go in the end. Moving from the slider pins, we'll continue on to removing the caliper slider boots from the caliper bracket so we can go ahead and clean out the ports of the bracket itself. Just have a look right along this area. I'm using a small screwdriver. You can also use a pick. We just want to carefully start pulling this out of position. Once you do have it out of there, you need to go ahead and give it a quick squeeze. Make sure it's soft and pliable, not torn, worn, or damaged. Of course, we will be cleaning out the inside. Typically, you can do this by twisting up a rag, sliding it right on through. At this point, we'll just work the boot around, trying to remove as much of the miscellaneous debris as possible. One last inspection of that boot. Repeat the process for your other caliper slider mounting boot. Once again, we're making sure that this is not torn, worn, or damaged. If it is, you want to go ahead and replace them. These look fine. We'll set them aside. Let's focus on the bracket itself. It's time to do some cleaning. We'll be starting with each of the 4 areas that we had removed those caliper tins from. To clean this, you can use a wire brush or some sandpaper. When cleaning it, you want to make sure there's no raised areas. Any miscellaneous raised areas can cause a braking issue. Just give this an inspection, repeat the process. Moving along to our caliper bracket slider ports, we'll be using some solvent, spraying directly in here. Keep in mind, as you spray in, it could potentially make its way out. Let's spray away from our faces. And a quick rinse. At this point, everything's cleaned. It's time to apply some high temperature lubricant. We'll lubricate inside of each one of the caliper slider ports. It's a good idea to have a good amount of lubricant in here. Now it's time for our caliper slider boots. When you go to install these, you're going to have to come in at an angle and start slowly pressing the rest in, working its way around. Just use a small pocket screwdriver along the inside. Give it a light tug to make sure it's completely secured. Repeat the process. We'll prepare our slider pins by lubricating them. When you do lubricate these, you want to make sure you lubricate the entire shafted area, but also make your way up into that groove that I had spoken about, closest to my glove fingers. With everything well lubricated, we'll go ahead and slide this right in. You want to make sure you have it in the proper orientation so each slider pin is in its original position. Once you do have it in, go ahead and give it a little wiggle. We're trying to work in that grease to make sure everything's properly lubricated. If you feel any restriction on these, you want to go ahead and disassemble it and re-clean it. There could be something on the inside there. I've got my slider pin that has that vibration dampener. We're making sure it goes back in the original slider port. It's extremely important to not mix this up. Just press that right in there. Push out any air. Once again, we're making sure we do have movement. Perfect. Continue on to cleaning each one of your mounting tins. Give them a close inspection. Let's lubricate our caliper bracket in all 4 corners where those mounting tins will sit. This will help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Now it's time to install our mounting tins here. If you were to look closely, you're going to find that you have 2 that look like this and 2 that look like that. We want to pay attention to the areas that protrude out. You need to ensure that they're facing out and away from the rotor. If you have them facing in this direction, it's going to hit up against the rotor and you're going to have serious issues. With that said, let's take these and get them in place. Just press it right on there. As you continue, make sure each one of them is secured. You do not want them sliding around when you're braking. Let's get this over to the vehicle. Reinstall your caliper bracket. Start in each of your 2 caliper bracket bolts by hand. Snug them up. Torque those to 77 foot-pounds. Now we can install the brake pads onto the vehicle. When doing so, we want to make sure we have them in the proper orientation. When pressing in the brake pad, if you find that you have a hard time putting it in and you have to use a hammer of some sort, typically it means you did not clean the caliper bracket well enough. Install the outer brake pad here. Same process, we'll just slide it right in. Double check to make sure you have movement from each one of your front brake pads. Now you should have some expander clips that will fit right into the brake pads. To install your brake pad expander clips, we'll be making sure that we slide them into the corresponding holes on the brake pads. While doing so, it's important to make sure you're holding onto the brake pads towards the rotor there. Otherwise, they're going to come out of the brake caliper bracket. Now, before we install the brake caliper, let's make sure we add high temperature lubricant to the side of the caliper pistons and to the back side of each one of the ears on the caliper to help with vibration dampening. This is essentially only on the mating surfaces. Let's take that caliper, we'll carefully bring it up and over the pads, holding everything in place. Now it's time for our 2 caliper slider mounting bolts. We'll start each of these on by hand. Now we'll snug them up and torque them to 20 foot-pounds. Double check to make sure everything's properly secured. Let's get the lug nut off of here. One last quick inspection in this area, and we'll continue on with installing our front wheel. Start on all 5 of your 21mm lug nuts, bottom them out. We'll get the wheel safely back down on the ground and torque each of these to 76 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely on the ground, we'll be torquing these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay, friend, we finished the installation of our front steering knuckle. At this point, what you need to do is go ahead and pump up that brake pedal till it's nice and firm. After that, take your vehicle for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.